One Step Ahead by Lundquist and Beslick.
This is One Step Ahead Radio. Welcome back, or welcome again to One Step Ahead Radio, which is one of the best sustainability ESG updates out there. Now, this week we have a special guest, David Frydlinger. He is a partner at Cirio law firm in Sweden. He will give us a bit of an update on what's going on, partly on the legal side, including a recent case on Shell in Netherlands, but also his view on what EU regulation in terms of the legal action is creating in relation to companies related to climate change, and I guess related to other things. He is also author of the book that he recently published, Rules of the Game, which is a very interesting piece of work that I have actually spent time reading, and a book that I think will enable many people to understand very complex things in a more simple, interpreted way. Now, before we go into that, what I would like to sort of update you a bit about is what's going on in the world. And as everybody knows, there is a COP29 taking place in Azerbaijan, in Baku. There are a couple of interesting things on this location in the world, because this is the country that you can only fly to. Usually you could take a train from Georgia, where I used to work many years ago, but nowadays you cannot do that because the government has imposed sanctions for these kind of travels during the COVID and has not lifted them since then. All the people coming into Azerbaijan have to fly in, which is what it is. And also what is interesting in Azerbaijan is recently there has been a big quarrel between the president of Azerbaijan, basically accusing president of France for colonialism in some of the colonies, or not colonies, but actually countries or territories that are still ruled by France, especially the ones that are in Southeast Asia. And what is interesting from between the lines is the fact that Argentinian delegation has left COP yesterday, and the reason why they have done so is that they have been called from a president of Argentina to leave negotiations. This is a big South American country and very important country for the for the climate talks, especially for this particular region. Is that he's been basically, I think, persuaded by Trump to do so. And what you can see between the lines is not only the fact that Trump's presidency or future presidency will have implications on U.S. withdrawing from climate agreement in Paris. It will also have a profound impact on many of the countries that have a bias towards the type of politics that Trump is representing with his new administration. And this is far more, I would say, cumbersome for climate agenda in the world than the fact that U.S. would, again, withdraw from the climate Paris Agreement. Now, we will talk about that a bit later on. There are some other updates from COP, mainly related to what the conversation is really about. It is about money, but it's not really about the climate. So we'll dive into that. But before that, David, welcome to One Step Ahead Radio. We hear you? You there?
Yeah, I am here, Sasha. Thank you for inviting me.
Welcome to One Step Ahead Radio, and thank you for making time for this. I mean, as I alluded in the intro, there is this case, and I've been talking about this for several years, increasing legal cases against companies for not meeting their targets, legal action becoming more intense, I would say, over the last couple of years, and EU regulation is in place now. Couple of days ago, Shell has been managed to actually get rid of this lawsuit against them on not meeting their climate targets. Could you take us through this? What is going on in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just one of several ongoing climate action cases ongoing in the world. And of course, this was depending on which perspective you take, this could be viewed as a setback. I think it's important to also recognize, first of all, that there was this profound judgment in the spring by the European Court of Justice establishing that protection against climate change is a human right. And there are several Supreme Courts in the world, like India and other countries, have also established the same thing. And I think that's on the positive side. In this this particular case with Shell, there's a specific rule under Dutch law as a general standard of care, which is quite unusual. We don't have it in Sweden, for example. And what the court, the district court said is under this standard of care, a company like Shell also has an obligation to respect human rights, and part of those human rights is to mitigate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the district court also came to the conclusion for a very specific number, i.e. that, well, based on science, Shell has to reduce it by 45% up until 2030. And now that was overruled, and I read the case, and I think it's quite well argued from a legal perspective. And what the court says is, yes, there is this, confirming that this is a human right. And I think that is very important that we have several courts confirming this. And said also that general duty of care has to be sort of interpreted in light of that duty of that human right. However, it's not possible under law to say that Shell has specific obligation to reduce its emission by 2030, by 45% by 2030. That cannot really be established if you look at, the legal context. That's the UN Frydlinger and other things, yes.
Yeah, but David, what you're alluding to, you have a general, then you have a specific. So what you're basically saying that, a legal, juridical system that we have in the European Union has still not been fully adopted to the new sort of a climate-related regulation. Is that the sort of what we are struggling with? Because that needs to be done.
Yes, and there is this new directive called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, that was finally adopted in the summer, but it's needs to be implemented under in the member states by 2026. And that includes also obligations to adopt climate mitigation plans, and Shell will be covered by that. Still, that will not impose an obligation on Shell or the others to have specific targets like 45%. But still, when those plans are adopted, then it will be much more open to litigate on these things again on more solid ground, so to say.
So, as a lawyer, is your anticipation that we will see more of the lawsuits coming up based on this new sort of I would say, inclusion or interpretation of EU's climate regulation into the sort of a legal system?
Yeah, no doubt. Definitely. And this is specifically this CSDDD directive, which is explicitly says that the member states should adopt rules allowing for civil liability suits against companies, also by NGOs and others. So I definitely foresee an increase in that.
And what is also interesting, I think the sort of financial penalties on this will be quite significant.
Yes, it's like GDPR levels, which is like 5% of the annual turnover. It's not really specified, it's up for the member state, but at those levels that we're talking about. So, this is a regulation, unlike this reporting regulation, which doesn't really have a bite penalty-wise, but these regulations will really have that.
And if we just take a stop there, what you're saying right now, which is very interesting, is that disclosure regulation has no bite because it doesn't bite, doesn't have a teeth. You don't get punished. But this one has a far more danger for companies on the financial side.
Yes, but I think it's important to look at it holistically, because even though, you cannot really be, it varies in the different countries. I think sort of breaches of the reporting requirements was criminalized in France. It hasn't been in Sweden, so it will vary, but it's no sort of obligation on the member states to impose sanctions on the reporting regulations. But this will have bite. But I think it's important to still see that, you're obliged to disclose much more under the reporting regulations. Everyone will be, not everyone, but very many companies will be obliged to disclose how they are, their emissions and their actions against emissions and other things.
But in terms of jurisdiction, I'm very puzzled with this, because you have American companies operating in the European Union. They will have to comply with European laws. I guess that's how it works. And if the politics in the US change, and Security Exchange Commission and federal authorities in the US are not as stringent as in European Union, American companies will still need to comply with this in the EU. Is that correct?
Yes, and also, I mean, that's an important point. Not only sort of, if you conduct business in EU, you will have to comply with those rules, but they also have sort of indirect extra territorial effects, because if you supply stuff to Europe, then European companies will impose obligations on their suppliers, for example, in the US, to be very transparent and also disclose their emissions, etc. Because those EU rules, they apply not only to the companies, but I mean, they are obliged to adopt those rules in the whole supply chain. So indirectly, all countries of the world, all companies all over the world delivering stuff to the European Union will sort of indirectly have to comply with those rules. And this is obviously the intention of the EU legislature.
CBAM and all of these other things which is widely discussed, I guess, in a COP as well. Any thoughts, I mean, from your side, James, any reflections so far in this fantastic conversation with David? Thanks, David.
Yeah, no, good morning, David. Very interesting. I was also going to pick up on that idea about, the extraterritoriality about it, because, the European Union loves to see itself as a leader on this, and it has huge implications for companies outside. It's not like you can move your company into a friendlier jurisdiction if you're still doing business in the European Union. I was just curious, though, to ask if you think you're going to see more of this kind of cases coming forward. I mean, to a certain extent, I saw the lawyer who was representing against, who brought the case against Shell, saying, this is okay. We lost the appeal, but it gives us ammunition to sort of to make a new case. Do you think there's going to be other cases similarly coming forward? Do you think it's going to be sort of a wider trend now that we're going to see more of these things?
Yes, no, definitely. And I mean, I read the case, and the court sort of opened up for other ways to attack Shell, actually, because and then the court said, well, they argue this and that, the claimant, but we're not sort of entitled in this case to bring those things up, so which will sort of open up for other cases, just also against Shell. And I mean, I think there is a database held by Columbia University monitoring all ongoing climate actions all over the world, and it's quite a significant number. It's definitely going to increase.
Thanks.
That's interesting.
Thanks, David. I mean, in terms of the book, I think your book, The Rules of the Game, I mean, is very interesting, because what you're trying to do is to take down very complex sort of a regulatory text and interpretation into something that is understandable in terms of the legal sort of a frameworks that operate in Europe. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the full title is the Rules of the Game of Sustainable Business, Laws, Contract, and morality, and that is what you say. I mean, the intention is to give an explanation and give a sort of holistic view, but also some details on the entire legislation. I just discovered a few years ago that there isn't actually any book written about this in English. I first published it in Swedish. So, and I mean, it's the dual purpose is to educate people on those rules, but also educate lawyers who may know the rules a bit more about, not least what is sustainability all about and sustainable business. And also, I also emphasize a lot the area of contracts, which is sort of one of my areas of expertise. How important contracts will be, and to adopt new contracting practices for
when we are there on the contracting practices, David. I know we had this conversation before, you and I. Yeah. This is basically, I mean, there is no. Right now, the traditional contractual agreements between the companies, B2B or whatever, between the suppliers or buyers, or doesn't matter, does not necessarily include any clauses related to regulation on sustainability or anything that will be legally binding. Is that your interpretation as well?
I mean, today there is no obligation to adopt. I mean, it is more and more common, but the common way of dealing with climate today is that the large company have a code of conduct that is imposed on the supplier and supply chain back to back, etc. And those rules are quite sort of, that mechanism is quite inefficient. But again, with this new directive, the CSDDD coming into force, first of all, there will be obligations for those companies to which this law applies to actually use those code of conducts, but now in a much more sort of non-power based way to collaborate with the suppliers, etc., to actually mitigate these risks. So we will see a lot of things happening in the contracting space.
Now, this is not a question directly related to either book or legal, but do you think the Trump presidency, with the power that he can enforce, will force European legislators to water down some of these? I mean, CSDDD and all of these other things. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we could anticipate something like that?
I
know it's not an easy question.
I know it's not an easy. My sort of spontaneous answer is, well, maybe not to water it down, but on the other hand, there are, as you know, forces to the far right in many countries who are quite opposed to these rules, and of course they will, they will have more, and they gained more power in the recent, European Parliament election, etc. So of course, him being president may give sort of those, having those political views an even louder voice. So in that sense, definitely, I think it will. It may have an impact.
James, any last reflection before we let David go? He has a speech to go to. So anything from you that you think we should address?
We'll even know it was just a consideration. I think it's very interesting, David, in terms of your book, in terms of needing to help a lot of other professionals and functions within companies to understand the implications of sustainability on their businesses. The more we go forward, the more it's going to impact, sort of, for example, the legal sphere, as you've been describing, and contracts and everything. It's not something that's just limited to sort of sustainability teams or finance teams or whatever. It's really becoming part of the fabric of doing business. I think that's a very interesting reflection.
And just if I might add just 1 minute on that, I mean, there's a lot of talk about EU over-regulating, and I mean, that's more of a political view, really, if it's over-regulated or not. But now, when I think I understand these rules, I think it's very much a matter of also of understanding the rules and sort of not getting lost among the trees, but to look at this holistically. And then I think those rules make quite a lot of sense. So I don't think it's over-regulated, actually.
Mm. Dave, before you go, last question from me. Thanks. Auditors. I mean, auditors have basically taken over entire sustainability reporting, disclosure. I mean, legal firms are basically in the outskirts of this, which they should not be. That's at least my opinion. But how come this is happening? Because is it audit? I mean, the Big Four and all of the other auditing firms are sort of making a huge amount of money of helping companies, giving them a sort of a semi-legal advices. Is that? I mean, that is a bit strange, isn't it?
Yes, I agree. I mean, no doubt the auditors have a huge role to play, not least because they will have to audit those reports being published, and then of course they cannot audit the reports which they have themselves consulted on. But as you say, I mean, many of those, they are giving legal advice basically, and I see sort of many lawyers non-present, and I think that's one thing. I mean, that's up for the auditor firms to think if that's appropriate or not. But I also think many lawyers, I discussed with many sort of legal departments, said, well, no, sustainability is not our concern in the legal department. I think, what do you mean by that? Those are legal rules. Where are you? And the same goes for law firms. So I think there's a joint responsibility here. I think, lawyers and auditors should join forces to help companies to adapt to these rules.
But it's embedded risk. If the legal departments are not really part of that sort of to me as investor, it poses a bit of a question, how prepared are they for potential issues that could be related to
5% of the turnover in the legal department, yeah.
Exactly. I think it's much more relevant for legal department. David, many thanks. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the insight. Thanks. Good luck with your speech. Thank you.
Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, One Step Ahead Radio continues. We have a couple of updates from around the world. There is one which is, for me, a bit tough to go through, and that is that U.S. regulators led by Federal Reserve have refused to endorse a plan that will have seen the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision push lenders to disclose their climate risk, according to people that are familiar with the matter. While it's not impossible that the US could reverse course, the Basel Committee has already watered down the proposal significantly to accommodate the Fed, said people who are asked not to be identified in Bloomberg article. The group is now bracing for a scenario in which its work on adding climate consideration to global bank reporting regulations may be shelved indefinitely. They said you have to bear this in mind because it's related to lending. And if we assume that the climate risk has a systemic implication and the banks are not expected to disclose this climate related risk on their lending books, it actually means that we'll continue operating in a world that will be more like a black box, especially on the banking lending side, which is not what we need. What we need is a more insight and transparency where these risks are, and especially from investment point of view as well, understanding where are the potential stranded assets going forward, and also how, as investment community, we can address that. In terms of the climate change and where we are, and with the COP29 in Azerbaijan, country that sources 96% of electricity from fossil fuels and gas and oil and gas, planning to increase its oil and gas production going forward until 2030 significantly. According to General Council representing Azerbaijan in these negotiations, it's a gift from God, nothing they can do about, and they will continue using it in the divine way in order to provide themselves with resources to continue doing what they're doing. Now, if you look at the numbers, the fossil fuels are actually still winning. Countries that promised to move away from coal, oil, and natural gas at last year's climate summit. New research that has been released this week shows that they are burning more fossil fuels than ever before. This is something that is, of course, not really good. The global carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels are on track to reach a record of 37.5 billion metric tons in 2024, which is a 0.8% increase over 2023 levels. According to the new data from the Global Carbon Project, it's a trend that puts countries farther away from their goal of stopping global warming, and it's actually not really anything close to what we heard last time the COP was in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, where they were talking about the transitioning away from fossil fuels. It is not really encouraging, and we know that, but that's the reality that we are in. And now there are several calls coming out of the COP29 between the lines that only summits in the future should be held in the countries that support climate action. This is a very interesting signal to UN organization in the way how these COP summits are organized. You probably know the story behind Azerbaijan. The Russia blocked, the Putin government blocked all the other Eastern European countries that would be a potential candidate for this, because of the aggression and war in Ukraine and political sort of instability this has created across the world. And Azerbaijan was the cold dish served to global community. And this is what the consequences of that are. So in terms of leaving the negotiations, I mean, it's rather, I would say, annoying to actually read this, and it is the fact that Argentina, and I mentioned that in the beginning, has left the negotiation, and now the question is if many other countries that are dependent on the U.S. foreign policy, economy, and other trade sort of related things will be leaving the COP negotiations because of the fact that Trump is together with the new the government and the new policies impacting many of these countries and creating a bit of fear on how they will continue having these relationships with the U.S., given the fact that the U.S. is actively planning to leave these negotiations. Now, I promised in the beginning to talk about the COP is not about climate, it's about money. And it has always been about money, but this time it's about who's going to pay who and how much. And of course, we know that the developing world would like to get paid from the rich countries in the West for historic emissions and also for the ability to transform the economies to become more sustainable. The touch point on this, or the most complex point, is how do we treat China? Is that developing country or is it developed? The other country that is also need to sort of transform the image of itself is Saudi Arabia, which is in the books of these negotiations since the beginning classified as developing country. Now, China will like to remain a developing country in these books and not be forced to pay up, which is something that also Saudi Arabia would like to do, to stay away from the money issues and actually be on the receiving side of this. There is a very interesting article from Christine Lagarde in the Financial Times. I would recommend you to read it. If you don't have it, I'll try to find a way to share it, where she talks about the need of transforming our economies for economic survival. The numbers that she takes in the article are related to trillions of dollars we need to invest in shifting our economic models towards becoming more sustainable. But she's also talking about potential cost up to 10% of the global GDP, and also enormous human suffering that will be caused by consequences of climate change. It's a very, very straightforward article coming out just a couple of weeks after Trump's win. And I think it signals a bit what the European Union is trying to do, and also what are the views of European Union in terms of what needs to be done in this space. James, any comments from you on the COP? Any reflections so far? I know you've been following that as well. What's coming out of there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first week has been, I suppose, a disappointment, as you've been alluding to. It's kind of, it's become a bit of a circus, and it obviously reflects, geopolitical maneuverings much more than actually the substance of what's going on in the negotiations. So the news we've been reading about, and that you've kind of mentioned, with the Argentina delegation being retreated and the French delegation, or the French negotiator, the minister, returning to Paris after the spats. I mean, that's all kind of reflects these wider agendas that are being played out, and unfortunately dominate the headlines. The things that I've been seeing this week that I thought were interesting, on day one, obviously Azerbaijan, the presidency of the COP, was keen, as they always are, every time, to have like a big splash announcement on day one, right, to come up with something. And actually, it was actually very positive, because they've been talking about the definition of Article 6, which is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which defines how countries can trade and collaborate towards their climate goals, in order to reduce emissions by sharing and transferring emission reductions. So this is it's very much connected to the whole finance discussion. And there were some people in civil society coming out and saying, well, they forced through the rules and there wasn't due process and they rushed it and we haven't had a proper... But I've been speaking to a lot of people in the last few weeks about carbon markets, above all in developing countries, in Africa and in Southeast Asia, Latin America. They really need this clarity on Article 6. This was specifically on 6.4, and now for next year we need to get clarity on 6.2, which are the two main instruments that are going to help facilitate all of this climate finance flows. So that was, I think, an important step forward. And the other one that is really key was the announcement from the multilateral development banks in terms of them raising their contribution. So the big MDBs like the World Bank coming out and saying that they're going to raise $120 billion a year in annual climate finance by 2030, which is way up from $75 billion that they did last year. And they're really a fundamental part of this whole transition and to facilitate so much of this climate finance, above all from the private sector. So if the private sector sees that these MDBs are involved in facilitating and giving them assurances, de-risking also climate finance, because it's doing deals in emerging or very low income countries. So that's another key thing that perhaps behind the headlines I've seen as kind of positive advancements.
Let's sort of stop there, and I think let's hope that the focus on the money will also bring forward a more sort of a creative solutions with maybe some regional focus going forward, because I think in many places that is what is needed. And I think that we will continue doing the updates. I mean, next week on what's going on in COP, and I think towards the end of next week it's going to end, at least for this time. The question is where it's going to happen next time. What's the symbolics behind the countries that are hosting it? And also, I mean, are there any really significant changes in the terms of how the oil and gas extraction in the world it's curbing, or it's so diminishing over time? It doesn't look like that. And there is an interesting article I read before we end this session that all of the countries, all of the oil that is drilled in the US and all of the oil that is imported, which is a very small amount, has to pay 9 cents per barrel for oil spill damages that could be caused. There is a fund in the US that is an oil spill, called Oil Spill Fund, that has billions of dollars in it. Apparently, there is a way to tax extraction of oil and gas to protect us from damages caused by oil spills, but it will be interesting to discuss, and there have been some proposals on how to tax oil and gas companies to actually protect or mitigate damages related to climate change. Maybe that's one of the discussions we could have at next One Step Ahead radio show that will happen next week. Thank you very much for participation. Thank you very much for being here, and we'll talk again next week. All the best.
Thanks, Sasha. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.